Joining me this morning. I'm super excited to talk to you. I'm just going to go ahead and pull up my questions and kind of kick things off from there. There's been just an introduction for me. I started my site a couple of years ago, and I started writing about everything for sale by owner over probably the past 12 months, and I've noticed a huge sort of groundswell of questions and just a bunch of comments and things from people who are trying to do this sort of alternative thing. And people have they have a lot of questions and they have a lot of issues too, I've noticed. Um, and so a lot more so than people who, use an agent, and then a lot of it's kind of done for them because the agent knows kind of like the process. And so I decided, hey, let me reach out to, as many experts as I could find and kind of go state by state. We're going to start with Florida because I happen to be in Florida as well. And we'll go state by state and try to figure out, what do people need to know if they're going to try to do this? What should they know ahead of time before they even get into it? And then once they're in it, what should they kind of look out for? So the first question, I guess, is how long have you been in the business, and what kind of drew you to real estate when you first started?
Well, I've been doing real estate work for about 20 years. And what appealed to me and still does appeal to me about real estate is that it's generally non-adversarial and everybody is happy. The buyers are happy, the sellers are happy, the real estate agents are happy, the mortgage brokers are happy, I'm happy, everybody's happy.
Right.
There was a time with short sales where that wasn't the case when the market tanked, and unfortunately, there were a lot of unhappy situations. But that's pretty much past now. That's history, and we're back to general feel-good feelings at closing.
That's interesting. I never really thought of it that way, but yeah, I mean, the buyer wants to buy this house, the seller wants to sell. It sort of is a meeting of everyone, I guess, is happy. That's an interesting way to look at it. That's very cool. Um, I guess now jumping right into like the for sale by owner side of things, like what's the number one thing that you see for sale by owners struggling with when they come to you?
Well, for sale by owners, it covers such a wide range because there are people who are very knowledgeable about real estate, and there are people who don't know the first thing about real estate. They all have a common goal. They want to sell their house and get the most for it in their pocket at the end. And they see a real estate agent as siphoning a good chunk of that proceeds away. And it's very understandable that people would want to do for themselves what they can and avoid the having to pay a commission if they're able to do it. When a seller decides they want to sell on their own, they also have to understand that if a real estate agent brings a buyer, that they're probably going to be in for an obligation to pay a commission, and maybe half the commission they would have paid if they listed with an agent. But the but the buyer's agent is certainly going to have to be compensated,
Right.
and that kind of diminishes their savings right off the top. Then they have to analyze, is the other half of their savings worth not having a real estate agent representing them? And that's a decision that the seller has to make. Now, of course, they may be lucky and find a buyer through one of the online sites, Zillow and so forth, and they can come without an agent, and then they can reap the full benefits. But real estate, real estate transactions are legal transactions. They are governed by law and by custom, and you really have to know what you're doing. And a seller who undertakes selling a property on their own really has to educate themselves. That is the key. They have to know what they're responsible for, even if they don't have an agent. They have to know what a buyer is going to expect, and they have to know the legalities of how they go about actually consummating the transaction, the actual closing. And there are normally expenses involved in selling. It depends, I suppose, state to state, but generally I can only speak for Florida where I practice. And in Florida, the seller is always responsible for the transfer taxes. So a seller has to know going in that he's going to probably have to pay the transfer taxes. In Florida,
Can you talk a
according to
little bit
local
more about
custom,
that? Like, how much is that transfer tax? How much should people expect to have to pay for that?
well, it's roughly 0.7% on the purchase price.
Okay.
So it could be substantial money.
Right.
The Also in Florida, some counties it's custom for the seller to pay for the title insurance, and in some counties it's customary for the buyer to pay for the title insurance. And they have to know what the local custom is uh, to know what both the buyer and the seller have to understand so they know what their costs are going to be in connection with the closing. And of course, when you have a buyer who's going to be financing, which is depending on the communities, usually in Florida, it's the majority of cases, but not every, some communities have amazingly cash sales. It depends. But then there are also taxes that the buyer will have to pay, which are associated with the with the mortgage taxes, note taxes, and such. So these everybody has to understand what their expenses are going in. If there's a homeowner association, the seller has to understand that getting the estoppel letter, which is basically a letter from the homeowner association indicating what the outstanding obligations are, or if the account is current. And and they always charge money for that. And that's a seller expense. If there are liens or judgments on the property that have to be cleared, that's another expense on the part of the seller. Now, the starting point of every transaction is a contract. And when you have a real estate agent, it's the real estate agent's responsibility to prepare the contract and present it and explain it. And it is a legal document, and it's a dozen pages long, and has a lot of fine print.
Right. And a lot
Lay
of
people,
disclosures too that I think a lot of people don't really understand as well. Especially, it's kind of scary too that I've seen, because I've seen what a real Florida contract looks like, and then I've seen what I'll call it the Home Depot version of a purchase contract, and it's like whoa, the generic stuff that people throw out there online is missing all these disclosures. And I think that's a big thing that people miss too, is all these disclosures that have to go in there and be worded a certain way to fit the legal requirements for the seller. So I think, yeah, you're right on that. There's a huge I think there's something like 5 or 6 is like a pretty large number of disclosures in Florida, depending on where you live, like coastal
Right.
properties and like stuff like that.
It's for a layman to read and understand the the standard Florida contract is very daunting, and even lawyers will argue over the meaning of certain provisions. So you, right away, you're entering a legal transaction when you do have a contract, and that contract, the standard Florida contract, is designed to be very even-handed, to be fair to both the buyer and the seller, and to protect both the buyer and the seller, as you indicated with the disclosures and setting forth the responsibilities of each party and indicating what uh, what how to avoid a default in certain situations when there are unexpected situations. If appraisals don't match the selling price, financing becomes an issue. The worst thing that could happen is if a buyer and a seller enter into a contract and the buyer intends to get a mortgage and he puts down a good faith deposit on the contract, and then he can't get a mortgage and he doesn't have the correct contingency provisions in the contract, and he's stuck with that contract and he doesn't have a mortgage to be able to buy the property, and he loses his escrow funds.
Right.
So real estate is a tricky ground, and to go into it on your own without representation, whether it's a real estate representation or legal representation, is really folly. It could work out fine.
Right. Yeah.
Risks you take.
Yeah. And so I agree with that totally. From what I've seen, I think just people need to know what they're getting into. And I think there's a large percentage of people who don't. So I'm not surprised that you've seen some folks who get into it really with not a whole lot of awareness about it. Is, I mean, look, what I say to people is put yourself on the other side of the transaction, and what would you want to know, or what, like, when you put yourself on the other side of the transaction, it starts to make sense why there's all these requirements and different things as the seller, because the buyer, they want to have some assurances. So that makes total sense, I think. Have you had any, speaking of that, have you had any sort of nightmare stories or any really, really kind of bizarre things that have happened when people have not really known what they're getting into? Have you had people that have really relied on you as the title person to like really do a lot of the legwork?
Well, the biggest problem is one I just described, where a buyer can't get a mortgage and he's didn't have the right contingency language in the contract, and the seller wants is legally entitled to the money and will claim it, the escrow deposit.
Right.
And the buyer is out in the cold, and he's out the escrow deposit. You know, when people buy a house, it is probably the largest financial transaction they're going to enter in their whole lives, buying and selling.
Right.
And to think that people would enter into these kinds of transactions with so much at stake and not have professional guidance, to me, is a very scary prospect,
Right.
especially when you're dealing in a realm that they're unfamiliar with and that has so many pitfalls. It is really taking a tremendous risk. And if someone comes to me and considering selling the house on their own, I won't discourage them if they want to save the commission. I mean, that's a valid objective
Right.
for any seller to be able to reap the most they can. But I would encourage him to retain a lawyer, especially in a county where the seller is responsible for the title insurance and the closing and has to pay for those services. Rather than picking a title company out of the yellow pages, I would recommend they hire a real estate lawyer and to handle the contract and to handle the closing and the title insurance. And this way the seller knows, and it's not expensive. I mean, my own fee to represent a seller and prepare the contract is $500. I mean, that's like nothing.
Right.
And at least they know that they're going to be protected. And someone is on their side looking out for their interest. And if I were a for sale by owner buyer, I would also retain an attorney. Again, I would charge $500 to a buyer to represent them in the transaction and make sure their interests are protected. Make sure that their the financing contingency is solid, that they give the proper notifications if they can't get a mortgage and do it in a timely manner. And because if you don't get an approval, and there's a window in the standard Florida contract, there's a window to get a mortgage approval.
And typically, what time are people looking at for that to get that approval?
Well, you can set that in the contract. It could be 30 days. It could be more or less, or usually more, not less than 30 days, whatever the parties agree. And if the approval doesn't come in within the time allotted, and you don't notify the seller that you did not get the approval, it's too late if you tell them the day after that time period expires. You're out of time.
Right.
And if you didn't get an approval and you didn't communicate that within that time period, you can lose your deposit. So it's really, I think, as important it is for a seller to have representation, I think it's equally as important, and maybe even more important, for a buyer to have representation, because it's his money that's being put up in escrow and could be lost. So professional guidance is key. And when you compare the cost of hiring a lawyer to the cost of a real estate commission, it's like day and night.
Right.
So,
I mean, yeah, for people watching,
it just seems to be.
Yeah, I agree.
I was going to say it seems the prudent thing to do for both a buyer and a seller is to have legal representation, more important than real estate agency representation.
Right. Yeah, and I think the key takeaway for people too is, hey, look, you can do this and save a ton of money and still do it right and still get professionals on your side. So I think, yeah, I would encourage anyone watching this, make sure that you're trying. We all know, like, you're trying to get the most out of your house, and that's great. But make sure you have professional representation too, and you can do it at a low cost, way lower than 3% and 3%, 6% of the total sale price of your house. So if you want to do that and you're willing to do some legwork, make sure you just get a professional. And I would say start that process of getting the professional early. Don't come to one after you've already laid down some sort of weird contract and money's been exchanged, and then you come afterwards saying, oh, I need help. It's a lot harder for Richard and other guys to help after you've done that than it is for you to get started on the right track.
Right. The important thing is to have representation at the beginning. Don't sign anything unless you have a lawyer look it over or prepare his own documents, and that really would be most ideal. To get a form out of the Office Depot.
Oh,
Uh, you're playing with
it's
fire.
scary.
This is just right, and it doesn't. As a lawyer, I'm speaking. It doesn't matter that we're talking about a real estate contract or a will or a power of attorney or any of these store-bought forms.
Yeah.
They're meant to cover the most general situations. They don't cover nearly all the specifics that they should, not by a long shot. And you're playing with fire. And there's there's a saying that a lawyer who represents himself has a fool for a client.
I think I've heard that one. And
All
that's a
right.
lawyer that
So if a
represents himself.
lawyer,
Right.
right. So if a lawyer can't be trusted to represent himself, how much more jeopardy is a layman who tries to represent himself?
It's
It just makes sense to have professional guidance.
right. Yeah, I agree with that, and I think it's and I think the other flip side for people too is there's also alternatives out there, and for people who what the commission is they think, well, 6%'s a lot, and it is. There's first of all, it's negotiable, and there's always alternatives, and you can always shop around and make sure you're getting the most professional guidance. And it's just I would highly recommend people just get professional guidance to start. That's the key thing, to start before you, especially as a seller, once you're getting started, you want to go down this road. Before you think about, because I have all these questions about, should I put my house on Facebook Marketplace? How do I run a Facebook local ad to get, it's marketing questions, lots of marketing questions. And the reason why I wanted to sit down and talk to you guys is because there's, before you even think about marketing or getting people in the door to look at your house, putting it on Zillow or anything like that, you want to make sure you understand that the process, the real process. And it's not as simple as I've been using Facebook Marketplace to sell like my old guitar and stuff, and like somebody comes with cash and I sell them my guitar, and it's very it works, but for your house, that's not exactly how it's going to work. It's going to be a lot more
Right.
complicated.
And we've been focusing on the legal aspects, but a real estate agent really provides a service too. It's not like you're giving them X percent just for the fun of it.
Right.
I work with a lot of realtors, uh, and most of them that I work with are really dedicated professionals that know their business, that work hard for their clients, that take their responsibilities very seriously, try to guide their clients, keep track of time frames that are important in terms of compliance with the contracts. These are dedicated professional people, and they do perform a service. And, and I can understand the desire to to save that commission money, but you get something for it.
Right.
And what you may get for it without knowing is a higher sales price that will basically pay for their commission or come close to it. And yet you get the benefits of all their service too. Because when a property is on the multiple listing, it opens up a whole new range of buyers, and real estate agents who refer to the multiple listing service for their leads to show prospective buyers. They go to the multiple listing service first, and maybe that's all they're going to go to. And if a property is not listed there, there's a whole reservoir of buyers that will never know about your house. And and these buyers may be able to or want the house more than the people who have given you offers and are willing to pay more. So that you just can't assume you're not going to get more money because you are not using a real estate agent. You may come up very close in the bottom line after all is said and done. You may come up very close.
Yeah, that's true. And what I tell people as well is, because I've read about these topics a lot, and there's a thing, there's ways to get into the MLS that some people may not even really know about, right? So there's people who will do it for a discount. There's companies like Redfin who are at 1% in some markets. There are agents who are also at 1% or agents who will do it for a flat fee. And so there's this whole, I'd say there's, and to getting in the MLS, I mean, I would say for sellers out there who are thinking about doing this, getting in the MLS is going to give you a huge advantage. Whether you do it through a flat fee and it's just the bare bones MLS entry for a few $100, whether it's you go with someone who charges 1% or 2% or some variation of that. I think, if you're savvy, you'll be able to go ahead and save some money and also get the advantages of having the extra exposure. And I think there's something like 90% of the buyers or something like that end up getting their house off of the MLS in some way or another. There's some statistic like that. It's very large. So I think getting in the MLS is definitely important, and there's ways to do it. There's a bunch of alternative ways to do it. So I'd encourage people to check out my post on that if you want to learn more about flat fee MLS stuff. But or discounters. There's a wide range of ways to do that. And then there's also alternative ways to get representation. So I'd encourage everyone to, yes, be savvy and save money, but also make sure you're giving yourself the best chance to succeed, because otherwise you're just wasting time and you might actually give yourself a whole lot of headaches. I'm all in favor of that. And I think what we're seeing too, honestly, what I'm seeing with my readership is there's a whole lot of people who decide that they want to maybe explore this topic and say, how do I save money and how do I sell my own house, basically? And they're sort of discovering all these other ways, and they're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. And a lot of people are doing flat fee stuff, or they're getting some sort of representation. They're not going at it totally on their own. And you're seeing sort of these alternative models pop up. And I think, for a lot of people, I think it can be good. I mean, if you really need to get that equity out of your house, you can do it in ways that make sense and also protect you, which is ultimately what you want to do, I think.
Well, it's certainly a viable option doing it by yourself, as long as you understand the perils and take the proper precautions, and then it can be a very rewarding experience in the end if it's done right.
Yeah, and I mean, for people if people are watching this have sold their house in Florida like 16 times or something, I mean, if you've done like a lot of transactions, you're gonna know. Okay, and the other interesting thing I'll say about, and Richard, you can tell me if this is an accurate statement from what I've seen as basically a blogger, is the real estate agents. The marketing is one thing, and yes, you're in the MLS, and that's obviously huge, but the other thing they help to do is the timelines of a contract. I think contracts seem to be very time based. You have X amount of days to do this, you have X amount of days to do that. And at any point, it's particularly for the buyer, at any point, and the seller too, but at any point, if you don't meet one of those, it's not and you don't communicate it or find and stay on top of it, it can become a huge problem. And I think one of the things that agents do really well is they help make sure it's a customer service thing. They help make sure everyone's meeting the timelines. Hey, we need this. Hey, we need that. There's all these moving parts. And then, to make sure that, and if something needs to be extended, they communicate it as soon as they can. And they deal with the personalities. I think there's a lot of personality differences too in a transaction sometimes. and with any deal, and the tensions can be high because it's a lot of money at stake, and people have limited resources, and and people are in it. It's almost like there's a site. It's almost like they're a therapist, maybe in a little bit of a way. Like, people freak out. Oh, like the appraisal didn't come in, or there's all these different things that might not, because there's always something. Well, what I would say is there's very rarely something. A perfect transaction. There's always something.
And there's another factor too, which is one of personalities. When a buyer and seller are working together without representation, very often the relationship sours during the process. For whatever reason, it could be over an article of property that's in the house, or something in the yard, or some point of disagreement, which can trigger a souring of the relationship.
Right.
And having two parties like that in such an important transaction not work in harmony can be detrimental to the whole process. And if each side is represented either by a real estate agent or an attorney, so that the disputes can be resolved through intermediaries,